Hi everybody, and to what I think is perhaps the most entertaining topic of our entire semester together, preschool cognitive development. I hope you will find that not only is this material interesting, we have lots of video clips as a part of this file here, and boy are those kids cute. That's about all I can say. All right, so as we cover cognitive development, in this particular file we're going to cover the first two bullet points here. We're going to take a look, of course, at Jean Piaget's preschool stage, which he calls the pre-operational stage. And then, just like we did for infant cognitive development, we'll update Piaget's work a little bit by looking at some more current research. And in particular, we're going to take a look at a body of work called Theory of Mind, which addresses one of Piaget's concepts. And it also has some interesting implications for lying, so hopefully you'll find a super practical twist on this particular video. And then as part of cognitive development, but it will actually be in another video, we'll talk a little bit about language development in kids ages 2 through 6. All right, so moving on to Piaget's perspective. Remember, Piaget is a psychologist who did most of his work kind of in the, 30s through the 70s or so. And so his view is an older view on children's cognitive development, and yet he introduced so many important concepts that we really can't ignore him. And indeed, as we've talked about, some of his ideas still hold true, or seem to have evidence even in the modern age. So we're going to continue talking about his theory, and we're moving on to his second stage of cognitive development. Remember that his first stage, infancy stage, was the stage of sensory motor development, where a baby, at least he thought, really had no comprehension of the world outside of their sensory interaction with the world. And you might remember we talked about 6 substages, and in the last substage, the child was starting to develop a capacity for mental imagery and symbolization. And in many ways, that is the transition to this second cognitive stage, the pre-operational cognitive stage. Pre-operational is kind of a fancy word. And its root, operation, we're going to see actually in the name of Piaget's other stages as well. So we might as well kind of define what he means by that. Pre-operational basically means pre-logical. The word operational in Piaget's model can roughly be substituted with the word logic. All right, so we're going to see that kids in the preschool period, which Piaget thought ran from about 2 to 6, although they do have some strengths, one of their major weaknesses ends up to be basically a lack of logic as we understand it. Okay, so let's take a look at some of those strengths, and then we'll spend most of our time, at the risk of being pessimistic, talking about some of the weaknesses of kids' thinking at this stage. All right, so as you see there, I've got listed 2 strengths of the preschool child's thinking skills. First and foremost are the use of symbols, right? And recall that at least in this context, a symbol means that we understand that one thing can stand for something else. So my use of the word cat can stand for a fuzzy reality that meows. Okay, I can pick up a stick, and it can become a symbol of a sword or a gun as I'm playing. And this is something that Piaget did not think that babies could do. And really he thought the main strength of the pre-operational or preschool child was that they did understand symbolic thinking, or they could use symbolic thinking. And he thought language development was, probably the primary example of that, but also the use of like imaginative play, beginning to do art, as we talked about, and representational drawings. Those are symbols. All right, so that's a huge strength that the preschool child has from Piaget's perspective. In addition, preschoolers are starting to engage in classification or categorization, as we might call it. And their use of this skill is very limited, but at least it's there. All right. So if you think about it, being able to form classifications or categories is a really important part of our interactions with the world, right? I mean, imagine if you couldn't kind of break things down by color or gender or topic of study. The world would just be this overwhelming stimulation of all sorts of unrelated um, pieces of information, if you will. So it's a pretty important skill to have, and preschoolers are starting to develop it, and they do an okay job of classifying things on one dimension or like based on one category. So for example, if we were all in a room, we could have a 3-year-old kid come in, and I could ask that kid to, find all the boys in this room and ask them to go to one corner, and then find all the girls in the room and ask them to go to another corner. That preschooler would be classifying us on the dimension of gender. Okay, preschoolers can do that, although as we'll see in a video near the end of this file or this film, even that is a bit difficult for them sometimes if it involves changing dimensions at any point in time. All right, but they can classify in one dimension, whether it's gender, adult versus child, things like that. All right, so those are some strengths of the preschool child. Let's now move on to some of the weaknesses. All right, we've looked at a couple of strengths. We're now going to look at a whole slew of weaknesses of preschool children and their thinking. And although these are weaknesses, I think we're going to find that they make preschoolers actually really about the most charming people on earth. So I don't mean this to sound completely negative about preschoolers and their thinking. All right, so let's move on to the first one, a lack of conservation. Well, Piaget loves his terminology, and conservation here has a very specific meaning, and it's probably not one that you've ever heard before. So if you know the word conservation, throw it out of your mind and learn Piaget's definition, okay? Or throw out any definition you've already learned and learn Piaget's definition. Conservation, a la Piaget, is understanding that despite a superficial change in something, okay, despite a superficial change in something, the identity of an object may not change. Okay, despite a superficial change in something, the identity of an object may not change. Well, what the heck does that mean? Well, think back, and maybe this describes you, maybe you know someone who's experienced this. Think back to what your parents looked like when you were a young child. And let's say you had a dad who had a big bushy beard. And one Saturday morning, that dad leaves. Maybe you're 4 years old, you're not 100% sure where he's going because you don't fully understand the world yet. Dad comes back an hour and a half later, and I guess he's gone to the barber. He has no beard. Okay. It would not be terribly unusual for a young preschooler especially to completely freak out and not want anything to do with this person. Shaving one's beard is a superficial change, right? I mean, literally it's on the surface. That's typically what superficial means, right? On the surface. And although dad no longer has a beard, dad's still dad. His identity hasn't changed. Okay. Conservation applies not only to people, it applies to things as well. For example, some of you may have seen foam rocks, maybe in a store where you can buy kind of unique trinkets. Sometimes you can find like foam that has been put in the shape of a rock and maybe painted to look just like a rock. Okay, a child who can conserve realizes after maybe picking it up and holding on to it that just because the appearance of a rock doesn't mean that it's actually a rock. Okay, so lack of conservation basically means there's a split between the essence of something and the actual identity of it. Okay, preschoolers are notoriously horrible at this. Okay, they seem to really have a hard time with the idea that appearance and actual identity or reality are not the same thing. So we say that they lack conservation. Okay, now Piaget explored this mostly in the context of the physical world rather than the social world. And so you'll see there's a button for you to go to a video, and I'm going to ask you to visit that video in just a second. And you'll see mostly preschoolers. The second girl in the video is not a preschooler. She's older, and you'll see she actually does fine. She conserves. But everybody else has a hard time with it. And you'll see that the tasks involve various aspects of the physical world, issues related to volume of liquid and number of objects and things like that. And you'll see that the younger kids have a hard time realizing that just because there's been a change in the appearance, it doesn't mean that there's an actual change in the identity of something. Okay, please go watch that video now before you continue with our video here. All right, the next item on our list is centration. Centration. Basically, this means that preschoolers have a really difficult time dividing their attention between different aspects of an object or a situation. Okay? Kids have a hard time dividing their attention between different aspects of an object or a situation. In other words, their attention gets captured by something that is really attention grabbing, right? Or we might use the word salient, S-A-L-I-E-N-T, salient. That means something that really sticks out. Okay, we actually saw this when we looked at Morgan's drawings last time. Remember how centered she was on the face of the person that she drew, and especially the eyes, all sorts of details about the eyes, but everything else just kind of never really showed up in her drawing. Okay, another example of this might be you know, a preschooler who visits a museum, and maybe the preschooler is, they sometimes are, you know, is obsessed with, I don't know, planes or something. And they get back from the museum, maybe the preschooler went with dad, and mom says, oh, what did you see at the museum? Preschooler says, planes, oh my gosh, there were planes. And mom says, oh, that's exciting, planes. What else did you see? Planes! I mean, it's kind of like all the kid can remember because his attention was just completely captured, and you know, memory seemed to be completely filled with planes. All right, and to some extent, centration may explain the lack of conservation that you saw in the video, right? I mean, if you think about the girl in the first clip with the water problem, as we call it, you know, she's kind of centered, if you will, on the height of the water. She doesn't take into account other aspects of the situation that are relevant. Okay, so conservation problems are due to a variety of things, but lack of centration, not lack of centration, but centration is probably one of them. Okay, lack of advanced classification skills. By this, we mean a couple of things. We've already talked about the idea that children in the preschool period can classify on one dimension, but one of the ways they lack advanced classification skills is they can't really classify very well on more than one dimension. You and I can already do that very well. You know, if I asked you to stand up in class and identify folks not only based on gender, but like on eye color simultaneously, so find all the guys with blue eyes, all the guys with brown eyes, and the girls with blue eyes, and the girls with brown eyes, you could do that no problem, simultaneously. A preschooler would have a hard time with that. Okay, so classifying on more than one dimension is a little bit difficult. Actually, it's very difficult. In addition, realizing, and this is the second problem with classification for kids of this age, realizing that some categories are broader or more abstract and include within themselves more specific categories can be kind of difficult. Okay, we call this hierarchical classification. The realization that some categories are broader and more abstract and include within themselves more specific categories. A nice example of this is actually, if you think about the religious world in general, we've got these, very broad categories. We might say that there are some, religions that are theistic in nature and others that are non-theistic. Things like Buddhism don't necessarily require belief in a god. That's a very, very general category. Within the theist category, we have Christianity, Judaism, all sorts of religions. That's a little bit more specific category. Well, we can break those categories down even further. Within Christianity, of course, we have the Protestant tradition, the Catholic tradition, and the Orthodox tradition. And especially within Protestantism, we can break that down even further by, looking at all the different denominations that exist. The relationship between all of those different categories is really hard for young preschoolers. And in fact, if you work with kids in a church context, or even know kids in a church context, you might sometimes hear them say something like, but, Daddy or Mommy or, Sarah or what have you, we're not Christian, we're Nazarene, or we're not Christians, we're Presbyterians, because it's hard to conceptualize that nature of more specific categories within more abstract categories. You'll see a nice example of this second kind of problem with classification in the video that I'll ask you to watch right now. Notice how the little boy has an awfully hard time generating more abstract categories into which he could group some of the more specific items that he has. Take a look at that video. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed that. That little guy is one of my most favorite kids that we see this semester. All right, I should note that a lack of advanced classification skills can also be one of the problems that contributes to conservation issues, right? So going back to that first girl in the water problem, if she could simultaneously classify on, say, the height of the water, but also the diameter of the various containers, she'd probably get the problem right, but she doesn't seem to be able to do that. Okay, moving on to a lack of reversible thinking. For our purposes, we'll just consider reversible thinking, flexible problem solving. Flexible problem solving, being able to work a problem from beginning to end, from end to beginning, or picking up the problem somewhere kind of in the middle and working, towards the end. We as adults do this all the time. For example, if you think about how you plan your day, often that is something you use reversible thinking to do. You may start at the end. You may know that you have to be at Bible study at 8, okay, which means you got to be leaving your dorm by 7:45. Notice how I'm starting at the end and working back, right? Which means you've got to finish your shower after working out, by 7. Which got to be done working out by 6:45. Yeah, and so on and so on and so on, back to, the time you have to wake up. All right, that would be an example of reversible thinking. Preschool kids do okay working problems from beginning to end, as long as they're not interrupted. But other than that, things get kind of dicey. And you see actually a bit of an example of this. It's a very quick example of this in the video on the lack of conservation. Near the end, that very adorable little girl was working with coins. And you may have noticed, and you might even want to go back and watch this again, you may have noticed that when the experimenter, no, sorry, it may have actually been before this, but in any case, at one point, she tries to count the coins. There's only five or six there, right? And she goes 1, 2, 3, and then she kind of gets confused. Okay, if you and I were doing that, we would pick right up where we started with 3 and continue on to the end. But she had to go back to the beginning. Okay, so she, working the problem from beginning to end of how many coins were there was kind of her only way of dealing with the problem of determining quantity. Okay, so reversible thinking can also help conservation and is probably tied into younger kids' problems with conservation. Two more left: egocentrism and animism. Egocentrism is probably a word that you've heard or used, but just like with conservation, throw out whatever meaning you think it means because you need to learn Piaget's definition, okay? Normally, in everyday language, when we say egocentrism, we mean something like selfish or narcissistic, something that has kind of a moral judgment to it. That is not what Piaget meant, okay? For Piaget, egocentrism is only a cognitive mistake. It does not have any moral overtones. When a child is egocentric, from Piaget's perspective, it means that all they can understand is their perspective, okay? And they assume that everybody else shares their perspective. Okay? They understand their perspective and they assume everybody else shares their perspective. Let me emphasize, though, that Piaget did not think this was a moral problem. He thought it was a cognitive problem, that memory and thinking skills had not developed sufficiently enough that the child could separate their perspective from other people's perspective. Right? I mean, it takes some maturity, and not just, like emotional maturity, but cognitive maturity too, to be able to understand people's viewpoints are different and to get into their head and kind of understand what their viewpoint might be. Piaget studied egocentrism even in just like a purely physical context. Do I understand that what I see, for example, is not the same as what somebody sitting across the room would see? Okay. Some of you might have experienced this if you've ever talked to a preschooler on the phone. Sometimes they will not give you enough information to understand what they're talking about. So for example, let's say you're talking maybe to a 3-year-old niece or nephew. We'll call him Peter, okay? And you say, hi Peter, what did you do today? What did you play with? And maybe Peter is just sitting by the toys that he played with, and he says to you, hi Aunt Sarah, I played with those. Well, that's fine if you're there and you can see them, but on the phone you can't see them, and that is not enough information for you to understand what he's talking about. Piaget assessed egocentrism through something he called the 3 mountain tasks, and you have a demonstration of that to watch in the video clip that's connected with egocentrism here. Notice as you watch the video that the little boy, he's kind of on the border. Pay attention to his language usage. Sometimes he uses pronouns like this or that when he shouldn't. Also pay attention to whether or not he can understand what the woman can see when she's on the opposite side of the 3 mountains. The little boy is kind of borderline. It's like there are times he gets it and times he doesn't. Take a look at that video. All right, the final weakness we're going to talk about here is animism. Okay, and animism is basically assuming that inanimate objects are alive. Okay, assuming that inanimate objects are alive. Right, inanimate means not alive, right? But assuming that your desk is alive or that your car is alive. I know one of my favorite forms of animism early in life was assuming that my stuffed animals were alive. I refused to let them be packed in suitcases because I was afraid they were going to suffocate or, at best, simply be lonely without me. Preschoolers tend to be more animistic than those of us who are older, firmly believing that their blankets can feel, their stuffed animals can feel, and so forth. Okay? So all of this adds up, all of these weaknesses really add up to this general lack of logic that Piaget identified in young kids. And because of this lack of logic, you get all sorts of really interesting beliefs and convictions on the part of preschoolers. They also can be pretty, shall we say, gullible. believing pretty much anything that, well, maybe not anything, but believing much of what they're told, regardless of whether or not it's true. What I'd like you to do at this point is go take a look at the last video, for which there's a link here, right? And watch like the first 6 minutes. We've already seen the final part of it. That's on infancy. But watch the first 6 minutes and see how easily these preschoolers buy into the concept of magic, and machines that, do amazing things, okay? And I'm going to include at the end of this video an extra credit option based on this idea that preschoolers, while their cognitive development is, far beyond that of an infant, still have some weaknesses that make them very gullible. And so at the end of the video, you can even take a look at it now if you want, you'll find an extra credit opportunity focusing on that gullibility of preschoolers in the context of some of our cultural traditions like Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Please be sure, however, to watch the final video before you move on. Now we're going to move on to a more modern approach to at least one aspect of cognitive development in the preschool period. This area of research, or this kind of model of understanding children's cognitive functioning, is called theory of mind. Theory of mind, which sounds kind of way out there. But as you see there, the basic question is really trying to delve into what children understand about how the mind works and how that develops over time. And this line of research, at least in some ways, can be compared to, or is parallel to, or intersects with, I guess that's kind of a contradiction, right? Paralleling and intersecting. But in any case, it's similar to Piaget's notion of egocentrism, right? We talked about egocentrism as one of the weaknesses of preschoolers' thought, and that meaning that preschoolers really can't get into other people's minds to understand what they would be seeing or experiencing or thinking. If a child is egocentric in a Piagetian sense, they assume out of naivete and cognitive immaturity that whatever they know, others know, whatever they see, others see, and that really betrays a very inaccurate understanding about how human mind works. All right, so this body of research that we're about to look at, really in many ways kind of intersects with or provides a modern spin on the idea of egocentrism. One of the main ways that theory of mind research is conducted is through various forms of what we call a false belief task. And we're going to see some of these tasks used in a video in just a few minutes. But let me give you a kind of an oral example of what a false belief task is right now. A false belief task can be as simple as a story consisting of a few sentences where the main character holds a false belief. So here's an example. Todd has lost his teddy bear. Todd thinks the bear is under his bed, but in reality, the bear is in the car. He left it like in the back seat. Okay? So Todd in this case has a false belief. And as psychologists use these stories to test children's understanding of the mind, there are at least two different questions they ask to see if kids fully understand the implication of a false belief. The first question is very simple. Where does Todd think his bear is? Let me repeat the story, and I bet you can answer it correctly, right? Todd has lost his teddy bear. He thinks it's under his bed, but in reality, the bear is in the car. Okay? So the first question being, where does Todd think his bear is? Well, obviously, from the story, it's said pretty clearly that he thinks his bear is under the bed. That being said, very young preschoolers, 2.5-year-olds to 4.5-year-olds, well, no, really more 2.5-year-olds to, maybe 3.5-year-olds. Once they know what reality is, they seem to be pretty egocentric. And they will answer the question, where does Todd think the bear is? With the statement, Todd thinks the bear is in the car. They, the children, know the bear is in the car. That must mean Todd knows it's in the car. So they don't seem to have an understanding that a false belief can even exist. There is a point in time, however, where children get that question right. In other words, they say that Todd thinks that his bear is under the bed. So they seem to understand that a false belief can exist, but they don't understand the implications of the false belief. Okay, they don't understand that the false belief leads to behavior on the part of the person holding the belief. So the second question that we would ask in a false belief task is, where will Todd look for the bear? Where will Todd look for the bear? And believe it or not, for many kids, there is a phase where they will get the first question right. Todd thinks his bear is under the bed, but when it comes to the question, where will Todd look for the bear, they actually then say that Todd will look for the bear in the car. Okay, so it's kind of like they understand that the belief can be false, but they don't understand that we act on our beliefs and not on reality. And so, as you see there, really the big change comes somewhere between, on average, 3.5 and 4.5, around age 4. Children finally have both of these understandings intact. They they understand that another's belief can be false. It may not match reality, okay? And that these false beliefs have behavioral consequences. Okay, so what I'd like you to do at this point is follow the link to the video. And this is kind of a fun video. Well, actually, all of them in this in this topic I think are fun. But the video starts out actually not with theory of mind work, but actually showing some studies of classification skills. Now remember, in discussing Piaget, we talked about the idea that classification skills or categorization skills in kids are pretty immature. We said that often they can classify in one dimension, but that's about it. Notice in the very first scene of this video that although the young preschoolers that they're testing can classify on one dimension, they have a really hard time changing that one dimension when they're asked to. It's almost like they get centered, right? Centration. The first classification rule they learn and then have a hard time admitting any others, whether it's centration or lack of reversible thinking, that the flexibility in thought is just not there. After you see the classification tasks with the ships and the bunnies, or the ships and the rabbits, or the boats and the bunnies, then everything from that point forward is theory of mind work. Okay? Theory of mind work. Assessing basically, do kids stand that another's beliefs can be false and that those beliefs have behavioral consequences. Take a look at the video, and as you listen to it, especially the theory of mind work, think about what implications this might have for kids and lying. And then we'll explore that. All right, so given the material we covered on the last slide and the video that you watched, I think it's pretty clear that based on modern research at least, it's not until 4-ish, maybe a little bit later, that kids really have an understanding of the mind that takes into account false beliefs and the impact of false beliefs. And I think that raises the question for us about the implications of the theory of mind work for children and lying. Lying is one of the more common problems that parents report with their children. And, so what does this tell us about the kinds of lies children tell? Do they tell lies before they have a theory of mind? And how should we relate to those lies? Let's take a look at what a lie is and think a little bit about the implications of that definition and the theory of mind work for kids and lies. So before we really integrate the theory of mind work with an emphasis on, kids and lying, we kind of have to define what we mean by a lie. And I always feel a little bit funny talking about this because I feel like I'm teaching you basically how to successfully lie, and that is certainly not my intention. There is a psychologist, Paul Ekman, who is very well known for his work on emotion in particular, but he's also done some work on lying. And so I'll take a look at his very specific and well-developed definition of what a lie is, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit about where the theory of mind work fits in here. Let's take a look at his definition. Okay, Ekman defines a lie as a false statement that the speaker knows is false, but says anyway in order to mislead the listener towards some negative end. That's a mouthful. Let's break this down and talk about it, in the context of false belief in particular. Okay, so a lie is a false statement that the speaker knows is false. All right, so right there, the first half of that definition presumes that telling a lie means you understand that beliefs can be false, right? Okay. So a false statement that the speaker knows is false, but says anyway in order to mislead the listener towards some negative end. Okay, but says anyway in order to mislead the listener towards some negative end. So that implies that you have to understand that the false belief you're trying to develop in somebody else has a consequence. Okay. This definition also distinguishes lies from mistakes. Right? When we make a mistake, we don't know that we've said something false. Right? I could say, oh, I love October, I'm so glad October, and really think it's October and be mistaken, it's already November. Okay. It also assumes that there's a difference between lying and, like maybe playing a trick on somebody towards a good purpose or for a good purpose. So for example, you might develop a very detailed false story to lead your roommate out of the apartment while you get it ready for their surprise birthday party. You're not leading them towards a negative end in that case. You're leading them towards a positive end. You want them to have a nice time on their birthday. Okay. So clearly there's a full false belief understanding that has to be here, right? I mean, a person has to know that false beliefs exist, okay? And they also have to know that those beliefs have consequences and want to be manipulating those consequences. All right. In addition, a truly successful really involves false belief on two different levels. Okay. It involves deception regarding the truth of the statement, and we've kind of already talked about that, right? You're deceiving somebody by saying something false when you know it's false. Okay. But you've also got to deceive them on a kind of a more abstract level, too. You've got to induce a false belief regarding their perceptions of your beliefs and intentions. So you've got to induce the false belief that you believe what you're saying and you are telling them not for negative reasons. You're telling them this piece of information. So there's a lot of kind of abstract stuff going on here. And given what we've talked about, and given the video that you saw that showed that young children, especially before age 4 or so, really don't grasp, sometimes they don't even grasp the idea that a belief can be false, and even if they do, they don't always grasp the idea that that false belief can have consequences. This really begs the question, do kids, before they make the shift to a full understanding of false belief, actually lie? Well, if you've ever been around young kids before the age of 3.5 or 4, my guess is you know that they lie, or at least they say things that are not true. You catch them red-handed with, maybe pie crumbs and filling all over their face, and you ask them, did you eat the last piece of pie, or did you eat the pie when you weren't supposed to? And they say, nope, I didn't. So clearly they're saying something that's not true. The question becomes, are they lying in the fullest, most punishment-worthy sense of the word lie? I mean, is it a truly elaborated, fully aware attempt at manipulating? Okay. And I think you might argue that when you're talking about very young preschoolers, before age 3.5, 4, that maybe their lies are qualitatively different. They have a different quality than the lies of, say, a 5, 6, or 7-year-old who already, in many cases, is going to be more aware of all of these dynamics. Let's move on to think a little bit about these young preschoolers and lying. All right, so here are some thoughts about young preschoolers and lying. Some of this will integrate the theory of mind work that we've just talked about, or the false belief work that we've just talked about. Some of this is also drawn from other research on the moral development of young preschoolers. And when I say young preschooler, I mean, say, before the age of 4 or so, 3.5 or 4. Okay, the first item reads, be aware that young preschoolers often equate the idea of a lie with anything that does not match reality. Often, and this is from more general moral development work rather than the false belief work, but don't seem to understand the idea of lie or to lie like we do. Often, especially if it's somebody else who's simply making a mistake, they will, maybe not often, but sometimes accuse the person of lying. And in part, that's because of the second item. Young preschoolers do not necessarily consider a person's intention to deceive, right? So if you say something that doesn't match reality, maybe you say grandma's coming tomorrow when in fact she's coming the day after tomorrow, but you just got mixed up. You might be accused of lying in part because your preschooler is not necessarily grasping the idea of intention to deceive as a core part of the idea of lying. One thing we're going to see when we get to the middle school period is that middle schoolers can be fairly concrete in the way that they think about things. That's even more true for young preschoolers. Okay, they don't necessarily understand, as the false belief work shows, the internal workings, the internal psychology of people. Okay, so what a lie is and the importance of intention to lying may not be on their radar screen. And that, may in part, understanding that may be in part an issue of time, cognitive maturation and the ability to understand more abstract ideas. In addition, young preschoolers may mix up what they wish were true with what is really true. I think we've seen, as we talked about Piaget in particular, that a lack of logic, really allows kids to buy into fantasy. And sometimes the boundary between reality and fantasy can be pretty thin for kids, right? And so, as they, maybe break your vase and you're in the other room and, it takes you a minute or so to get in to see what all the commotion is about, and the dog has come in the meantime, your son or daughter may say, Fido broke the vase, not me, as they've had a minute or two to, kind of wish that they hadn't touched the vase, but instead Fido had. And remember, although the false belief work suggests that kids start to overcome egocentrism earlier than Piaget thought, right? Not 6, that's when Piaget thought that the pre-operational period ended, but probably more like 3.5 or 4. When they are egocentric in the younger preschool period, what is in their mind for them is reality. Okay, so with a young preschooler, what they assert to be reality may well be what they wish was reality, but for them it's become very real. Okay, and then the last item really ties us back to the false belief work. If you spend time with young preschoolers, you again will see that they tell things that are not true. But that may be more reflexive, right, out of fear, rather than with this really kind of elaborate, thought out intention to deceive and to, bring you to the negative end of not punishing them, and maybe even, you know, well, I'm not sure what I want to say there. Never mind. In any case, um, the main idea here is that I don't know that I would assume that a 2.5, 3.5-year-old has this really elaborate plan to deceive you. The lying may be more reflexive than anything. Just seeing how mad you are and kind of wanting to get out of the situation. Now, as children grow older, I think we can hold them a little bit more responsible for their intention to deceive us. But I hope that, as you look at these items about young preschoolers and lying, you realize that when you're talking about young children, again, probably at least up until 4 or so on average, that a situation that involves lying probably should be treated um, with a heavy dose of education for the child. I'm not saying there shouldn't be consequences, but there probably needs to be explanation. There probably needs to be an attempt to show the children the evidence against their perspective and why that's important to your understanding of the situation. So the kid with pie filling all over their face, there's insisting they didn't eat pie. Maybe it involves a trip into the bathroom so that they can look at their face, and not that you're nasty and say, look, you've got that pie stuff on your face, I know you're lying, but that you, with a calm disposition and a warm heart, explain to them, I hear you saying that you didn't eat the pie, but please take a look at your face, honey. I see you've got pie filling on it. And usually people get pie filling on their face because they've been eating a piece of pie. So gently pointing out the evidence and helping them make the cognitive connections. All right. So I hope you found this last item to be kind of a practical application of some of the experimental and laboratory-oriented work that psychologists have done. In our next lecture, we'll get into a discussion of language development and move on from there. Bye-bye. All right, so here's the second of what will probably be 2 extra credit opportunities during this online portion of our course. Consider the following, and again, I would encourage you to post it to the discussion forum in Joule if you don't mind sharing your ideas with your classmates. Otherwise, you can bring me a hard copy really anytime before the end of the semester, anytime by the last regular day of class in December. Okay, so here's this opportunity. Given, first of all, the cognitive weaknesses of young preschoolers, which seem to lead to gullibility and a willingness to believe whatever they are told by adults, and secondly, how young preschoolers understand lying, consider the following. What will you plan to do with your young children regarding the traditions of Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy? Address each tradition and explain why you would approach each tradition in the way you've chosen. You may have a different plan for each tradition. So you may decide to address Santa Claus a little bit differently than the other 2 or something like that. Let's see, what was I going to say? I really don't remember. Anyway, the reason I think this is kind of an interesting thing to discuss is that, especially with young preschoolers, again, before, age 4 or 5 or so, first of all, they are going to buy into whatever myth you spin at home, or whatever myth they hear out in the wide world of peer relationships. In addition, sometimes if a family does one or all of these traditions, kids can be pretty jaded when they find out that these people or creatures don't really exist. And normally we would discuss this in class, and I've had students over the semesters, say, maybe happens once every other year, that they were downright furious that their parents had lied to them. when they found out. Now, of course, as adults, they look back and they understand it all better. But at the time when they found out, age 5, 6, what have you, that these folks didn't really exist, they were pretty angry. All right, so think about it. I have actually different opinions on the three that are there. I think, Santa Claus, if I had kids, I would address it one way, and the Easter Bunny and Tooth Fairy I'd probably address in different ways, and each of them maybe in a different way. But, there are ideas all over the spectrum, even from, really committed Christians. So please feel free to share what you think is the best approach. And I won't hold it. I'm not going to hunt you down, 10 years from now and see if that's actually what you're doing. But at this point in time, what do you think you'd do regarding these three traditions, and why?